Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of the Mind Muscle Connection podcast. Today I have a very special guest, Bryan Boorstein. He is back on for the fourth-ish, I'm going to say fourth-ish time. It's around there, give or take one or two. But yeah, man, welcome back onto the podcast.
Thanks, Jeff. Always a pleasure to be here. And now that we're working together, I feel
Yeah.
like maybe we'll even do these things a little more often. So good times all around.
Yeah. So for anybody that isn't aware, Bryan, I had Jeremiah as my coach for a while, and then I switched, had Bryan take over. He's doing my training, and it's been really cool so far. And we'll probably dive into my training here a little bit, but I wanted to start more so, on your side of things. It's been a little while since we've had you on, so I don't know if there's anything that's been going on in the last couple months, and then we'll kind of transition into your training.
Yeah. Well, the last two mesocycles that I've done have been straight up hypertrophy focus, like very similar in construction to kind of the way that we're doing things with you right now. Similar kind of progression model and stuff like that. The one, I guess, big thing that's different with my training is that since October 9th, which is exactly 3 months from prior to now, I've been training only my left arm with direct work and using both arms for upper body pulling and upper body pushing, but just training one arm directly. And so I just made a post on Instagram today, as you and I discussed, kind of outlining some of my thoughts around the first 3 months of this experiment. And yeah, now I'm sure you'll probably want to touch on that, but I'm literally, as of yesterday, I jumped into what will probably be a 5-week neural phase. And so training looks way, way, way different now than it did for the last 3 months. Lower volume, 3 times a week, full body, mostly compound movements, no intensity techniques, working further from failure. I often look at these strength phases, however you want to say, neural phase, strength phase. I often just call them a maintenance phase, because I'm not actually really trying to drive strength adaptations per se. I'm more just trying to take a break from hypertrophy before I can get back into it again.
So a couple things on that. You mentioned that you were strictly focused on like hypertrophy work the last couple of mesos. Is that what you mean by that, where you're saying that it was hypertrophy focused and like you're talking about kind of like neuro type training? Is that kind of what you mean by specifically hypertrophy style training in terms of?
Well, yeah, hypertrophy being, 6 to 12 plus reps, more volume per se, working much closer to failure, and then also utilizing a lot of the intensity techniques that we're using with your training right now, such as different ways to accentuate the lengthened portion of movements that are inherently short overloaded. So I think we've touched on that topic on prior podcasts I've been on, but for any listeners that aren't privy to those, essentially, when you have a movement, like we'll just use a bicep curl because that's a really easy to understand one. You have the lengthened position of the bicep curl where your arm is extended and your bicep is essentially stretched. And then you have the contracted portion of the bicep curl when your arm curls up and your fist gets closer to your shoulder. The muscle gets shorter. And so that's called the short position. And using the dumbbell curl as the example here, you're essentially fighting gravity. So at the point where your forearm is parallel to the ground, which is very, very close to the top of your bicep curl, that's going to be the hardest point of that movement. But that bottom range from where your arm is extended and the bicep is stretched, that portion of the movement is much easier than the top portion. And so we've been using a lot of these techniques to try and provide more tension in that range of the motion that lacks as much tension as the other parts.
Well, and there's been, I know like the first one that comes to mind is like Milo Wolf's, research too, where, training in that lengthened position seems to be, that's kind of the kind of secret, that's where a lot of the gains you see are made is in that lengthened position. And I know that there's probably been some back and forth. I think you said I think we did talk about this in terms of like, oh, for biceps, you just want to do this and that, like you only want to train and shorten, but as we know, it's good to do both and switch it up. And so like, just to kind of give somebody exercise dependent, like in my training, it's like the dumbbell incline curl or the face away cable curl is going to be more of the lengthened, and then the like spider curl is going to be more of like the shortened, correct?
Yep, correct, exactly. And then we have some muscle groups, actually one muscle group specifically, like the back or the lats, that it's almost impossible to train with a lengthened overload. You can train at long muscle lengths, and so there's a nuanced distinction between the two. But in back or lat training, it's very, very difficult to overload the point of the movement where your arm is fully stretched, because we as humans are just weaker as the arm approaches the torso. So as the muscles get short and they contract, the way you say that would be that the strength curve is short. So in many back movements, we have a problem because the strength curve is short, but also the resistance curve is short. And so that means that like a movement like a pull down or a cable row or a dumbbell row or something like that, it is both weaker in the strength curve and in the resistance curve at the short position. Whereas some movements, like for example, the incline dumbbell curl, it is in fact still overloaded at more of a mid-range because you're still basically fighting gravity. But what it does is it trains your bicep at a longer muscle length because of the way the bicep is behind the torso. So we're stretching the bicep out more, but it still isn't necessarily overloaded there. Whereas when you take like a face away cable curl, we can make it both more lengthened overloaded and be training the bicep at a longer muscle length. So it's an extremely nuanced topic, but essentially the whole idea is utilizing, a lot of that research that's come out from Milo. And actually I've been doing that for years before this research even came out. But kind of using the fact that we know there's more gains to be had in the length and position of movements, and then kind of finding cool, unique ways that we can accentuate that.
Well, and I find too, when I get like form videos from clients, I just find that that's always the like range of motion that like gets skipped out. Like if you like look at clients like form videos, it seems like that's always the one where like people don't ever get to that point either. And I feel like it's, we know there's a lot of research behind it now and everything like that, but it's like also I feel like a lot of people don't train in that range of motion either.
Well, we're super weak there, right? So like when you do a face away curl on the cable and that arm is kind of a little bit behind your body and you let the bicep stretch back there, like you actually feel weaker there. And so it's much harder to get the weight going without letting the elbow come forward and using a little bit of shoulder flexion in there. So I think inherently, if you're not like very aware of this and in touch with your body, like the natural inclination is for you to cheat that bottom range because you do feel a little bit weak there.
Yeah, that's again what I like you said, it's not even necessarily like people are doing it on purpose. It's just like from the lack of awareness, and I think once you can add that in, it's definitely a game changer. And on the back, is that, maybe part of you mentioned it's hard to kind of train that in more so the length. Is that why like a lot of times it's like you don't, like for me at least, I find that the back is usually a muscle group that typically doesn't ever really get like super sore or anything like that.
Yeah, I think that that's a huge reason why the back doesn't get sore, because we just can't train. We can't overload it at a lengthened position. We can train it at long muscle lengths by using some of that cool stuff that Cass and N1 have shown, where you can kind of do what they call a pull around. So your arm sort of adducts across the body and stretches the lat out. And for anyone that's interested in going a little deeper on this, my dude, Abel Chabai, you can search him on YouTube. He just put out a really cool like 30-minute video about everything he's learned about back training over the last couple of years, and he has like a 3 or 4 minute segment in there where he's like touching his lat as his arm does different things, and you as the viewer can kind of touch your lat and kind of feel what's happening at different arm positions. And it's very obvious when you go through this drill that the way that you stretch your lat isn't directly overhead. That's stretching a lot more of the musculature of your upper back when you actually put your hand tactilely on your lat. But when you reach your arm across your body, sort of like that old stretch you used to do probably in like any sport you played in high school, where you like take your arm and you stretch it across the body, that is literally where the lat stretches, and you can feel that if you touch your lat with the opposite hand.
Yeah, you had me incorporate something very similar to that. We had to kind of change it up, I think, just a little bit in terms of the, the actual cable setup I have. But definitely, I can tell in that exercise, I feel that lat stretch a lot more in that exercise. God, I had one more. Something came up to me. Oh, and I would say too, for me, like the last couple of years in terms of the back, maybe even more so the last year, the back, I feel like it's been the biggest game changer in terms of like the difference in like training. Like obviously training more in the lengthened position and working with you and really, and we'll talk about some of those things, but I feel like the back has been the biggest thing where like for me, a lot of my back training was probably upper back focus, rear delt focus, and I just didn't even realize it. And then on top of it, I would do like a bunch of like rear delt specific exercises too on top of it. And it was just like, damn, I could just see where a lot of that's probably got a lot of that wrong with the back training. I think those things can take you far, but I think that's probably where you can take it to the next level with your back training and really make a big difference in your overall, how your back looks. And that's, I mean, let's be honest, I feel like that's where a lot of people are lacking in general.
Yeah, I think that, if you did vertical pulls and horizontal pulls and you had no regard for what your elbow was doing or the angle of your pull or any of this really super nuanced stuff that we talk about, like if you just did wide grip pull downs, pull ups, and bent over rows forever, you would probably get the majority of the development that you would get in your back. So I think my stance 2 years ago would have been like, yeah, you're like not training your lats if you're not doing these super specific movements. Like you are training your lats, you just possibly could be training them more effectively. And if the back is an area for you that isn't as developed as you want it to be, then it's probably worth experimenting with some of these techniques and trying to get more out of those positions.
Yeah, no, I like how you put that. And I think too, as you get more advanced, it's like you always need to be, if you want to keep progressing, just like I think in any sport or anything like that, it's like if you want to keep progressing, you need to start finding these little things do start to really add up, and it could, it could make a difference for you. So cool little, I feel like side talk there. And this is why I don't think we'll get to all of our topics today. But so for your one arm training, if you don't mind, I know you made a post, but if you don't mind, maybe sharing a few things that you've kind of have found so far.
Yeah, so given that I have 25 years of training experience and I also have 7 or 8 years of CrossFit experience where I didn't do any direct arm training at all, and I didn't really feel like my arms changed much during that period of time. My theory going into, or my hypothesis maybe, would be that I didn't expect any change to happen at all. So to give some context, I am training my left bicep with 10 to 12 direct sets per 9 days. That's how my microcycle is set up. And then I'm training triceps, my left tricep directly with 8 to 10 sets every 9 days. So there's literally like 20 sets of arm work that I'm doing for just my left arm, and I'm not doing any direct work for my right. And despite that, my hypothesis was that nothing would happen, that my left arm wouldn't grow and that my right arm wouldn't shrink, and that essentially at the end I would be like, hey, that basically means that either A, I don't need to train my arms at all anymore, or B, maybe I'm just not growing in general because I'm 40 years old and I'm just not making more progress, which would be the more depressing of the two. What I would have loved is if neither of them grows, neither of them shrinks, and then I'm like, hey, but at least I can now put more volume to my quads, hamstrings, back, and chest, something like that. But the way that it has turned out, at least here at the 3-month mark, so this is a 6-month experiment. I'm halfway done now. According to my measurements that I took 4 times this morning, both arms grew just under a 1/4 inch.
Okay.
And that really, really surprised me. I didn't expect that, of course. And I've had a number of comments already from people that pointed out something very obvious, which is there could be user measurement error. Like I could have literally just measured it slightly differently both times that I measured it. And second, it could potentially be inflammation, glycogen, water retention. I mean, there's a number of different things that could have affected that data that I have. But I think that at a minimum, what it tells me is that things didn't get worse for the arm that wasn't trained. So that's super cool. And then on the positive side of this experiment, one of the things that I kind of was hoping would happen and has come to fruition is that my left arm has become more coordinated. And so prior to this experiment, anytime I would do single arm presses or single arm rows or pull downs or whatever, I would always be a rep or two shy with my left arm. And I would have to, my right arm would get, say, 10 reps to failure. And then my left arm would be like 9 reps plus a partial or something along those lines. And now, after only directly training my left arm for 3 months, those are more equal on my upper body pulling and pushing movements. So it seems like in some ways, due to the neurological coordination aspect of training only my left arm, it does seem to have begun to catch up with the right arm in those types of movements. The downside, the negative so far has been that I have I wouldn't call it significant, but noticeable tightness in my upper scapula on the left side. So you could call that like my rhomboids and like kind of thoracic and lumbar lat regions in my teres. Like that whole region of my upper back is just tighter on the left side. And that makes sense. I mean, I'm doing 20 extra sets on my left side than I'm not doing on my right side. But that kind of sucks because I inherently have a tighter upper scapula on my left anyway. Like even before I started this experiment, I had some kind of annoying like tightness throughout those same regions of my back. And this experiment seems to have exacerbated that a little bit.
Yeah, I could see that. Like you said, you're just using that, you're using that side just so much more. So it makes sense that, over time you just, that just same thing with like when you run or anything that involves like high volume, it's like once you do those over and over again, and it's going to start to add up over time. So one other aspect of this too, they kind of, there's that concept of like cross education, I think is what it's called, right? Where you do train one limb and you see strength. I'm assuming, was that kind of like part of your like thought process going into this as well too? Where like, if somebody has like an injured limb, it's like, hey, train the other side and you'll maintain some strength in that other limb.
Yeah. So from my understanding of that literature, and I'm possibly wrong on this because a lot of people commented a similar thing, but my interpretation was that those adaptations are almost entirely neuromuscular or neurological rather. In that, yes, the strength could potentially be viable on the untrained limb, but I don't believe that there's actually like a muscle size increase associated with that.
Which makes, I mean, that makes sense if you think about it. Again, you're doing that movement on the one side, so it's like you said, from a neuro standpoint, you're going to maintain kind of how to do that on the other side. But it's like from a hypertrophy standpoint, it's like you're not actually using that muscle. So it's like you're not sending that signal to maintain it or build or whatever it may be.
Yeah.
So one thing too that you mentioned, so the inflammation, things like that. And I guess too, are you right-handed? Like normally, is that your dominant side or is it left? I don't know if you said that or not.
Yeah, my right is dominant. And that's why I wanted to do this experiment. I've actually, throughout my entire life, I've been kind of on a mission to equal out my two sides. So even, man, it goes all the way back to 8 years old. I remember I was trying to get really good at basketball, and my coach told me at the time that I needed to start brushing my teeth with my left hand and dial the phone with my left hand and carry the groceries with my left hand and dribble the basketball constantly only with my left hand, and like all these different drills to try and improve coordination and accuracy on the left side. And so I've always been hyper aware of that. And I even took it to an extreme when I had my first kid 5 years ago. I made a commitment to only hold him with my left arm. And that was actually, in retrospect, I believe the culprit of why I have this incessant upper back tightness on my left side. Because for an entire year, I held this kid only on my left arm. And so in retrospect, I think that was probably a bad idea. Doing all the neurological stuff when I was younger for basketball was probably really good. But actually doing something weight bearing like that for an entire year, every single day, I think probably had some of those detrimental effects.
And progressive overload too, right? Because he was getting bigger as the year went on too, especially in especially in the first year too, right? I feel like you're pretty much growing, month by month there in terms of weight. So
Yep.
Forced progressive overload there. So that brings up a good topic. And this is kind of, with unilateral training, how do you typically go about that? Is it something where, like say for you, you've always started on the left side with that, and then like do you try to match reps on each side? How do you typically go about the unilateral training?
Yeah, great question. I actually have had so many questions on this that I wrote a blog post for my company, Paragon Training Methods, where I went over 2 different ways that you could go about kind of working to equal this. And so I have one way that I think is probably a little bit more applicable to general population. And in that example, what I usually do is have people start with the weaker arm and basically work it to whatever the RIR is, and then match that on the strong arm or leg, even though you would understand that the strong arm or leg would be getting less stimulus. We know, given the research on maintenance volume and stuff like that, that if I'm training one limb to failure and the other limb at 2 RIR or something like that, we don't have to worry that I'm gonna get worse on the 2 RIR limb, right? So that's the way that I usually would do it, and then on top of that, I would have somebody go back and do the weak limb again for an extra set. So say we have 3 sets of 8 to 10. It would go like left arm, right arm, left arm, right arm, left arm, right arm. And then I would come back to the left arm immediately after the right arm and get as many reps as I could. So you're essentially matching performance on the main work sets, but then you're getting a little bit of extra volume by coming back to that weak arm for a 4th set. However, my second approach, which I think is more for kind of advanced trainees and I think advanced trainees, and I'll get into why here in a second, but I have people starting with the strong limb and then matching reps with the weak limb, even if that means having to do partial reps to match it. So maybe I go to failure on my right arm and get 10 reps. And then, like I said in the example earlier, I do 9 + 1 or 8 + 2 on the other side. However, the downside to this approach, and why I think it's for advanced people, is that you have to know what movements are conducive to doing that. So like you have to know that if you're doing a like Bulgarian split squat or a single leg RDL, that you're not going to perform really well on your right leg and then perform worse on your left leg and be like, well, fuck it. Brian said do partials. So I'm going to sit here and try and do like a single leg RDL partial. I mean, that doesn't actually work in application because of the resistance curve, like we talked about earlier, being a lengthened overload movement. So that advanced protocol only really works if you're using a short overloaded movement.
Gotcha. Yeah, no, that makes sense. Yeah. So again, Gen Pop, it's going to be, you're going to start on that weaker side and then potentially throw in a little bit extra volume there. Did you say that was like a kind of a for sure thing, or is it that you always do, or is that kind of like just depends on the movement and the person as well, in terms of adding in that extra set?
Yeah, I think adding the extra set makes sense across the board for everybody. Okay. Because that limb is weaker and we see some correlations between volume and, if not increased muscle mass, we at least see correlations between increased volume and increased coordination and neurological efficiency. So I think that does make sense to do a little bit of extra work on that weaker limb, especially when you're starting with the weak limb and then matching on the strong limb.
And then, so for somebody that do you, with the unilateral training too, is it because sometimes I think some that I've noticed, at least in my training, is you'll do one side and then it's like, some people say go straight into the next set or wait a little bit in between, right? Because it's like sometimes, like for example, you do like a Bulgarian split squat or something, it's like you're just out of breath, right? And your kind of cardiovascular ends up being the limiting factor there on that second side that you do. Do you have people wait in between as well too, when they go from one arm to the next or whatever it may be?
Yeah, my statement in my programming is always rest equally between limbs. So okay. Whatever equally is, like if you would normally rest 3 minutes, between doing a set of squats, maybe you split that difference and it's 1.5 minutes between each limb. But I think that the more advanced you get, the less relevant that becomes, because I don't know about you, but I've been able to take a set of split squats or single leg RDLs to the point where it feels just as daunting as doing a bilateral set. And I need 3 or 4 minutes before I can even go back and do the other leg. So I think that it depends a lot on training age and just kind of how hard you can push yourself.
Unilateral training, man, it's good, but there's definitely a love-hate with it because it's like you do it once and then it's like it's almost like double the sets essentially, right? And then this was something I think I mentioned to you. I know I talked to Jordan Litz about this, but like I think there was a couple of them. The one that I don't know which exercise it was for sure, but you had like rest pause sets in there as well on these unilateral stuff. I'm like, man, this freaking sucks because it's like you got to push yourself to, close to failure on that, doing rest pause, and then you rest that arm and you got to freaking do it again. Whereas like, if it's bilateral, it's just like, it's just one time and you're done.
Yeah, dude. No, I know. I'm right with you. I've like Jordan and I have talked about this too, and I don't know if you've heard him talk about that experiment that he did where he tried to not change training for
Yep.
like 5 months or 4 months or something. And what he noted was that the only things that he did change was movements that require a lot of setup or a lot of time commitment. And so
Yep.
I've kind of literally found the exact same thing where, if it's got a lot of setup, like a rear foot, front foot elevated Bulgarian split squat with like 18 different pieces of equipment that you have to drag over, man, those are the first movements to go. And so it's same thing. Like if you're doing just a standard sagittal plane, like one arm pull, then I think in most cases it probably makes sense to do that bilaterally. The advantage to doing the unilateral would come when you're reaching across your body, like we discussed in the beginning, and trying to get that extra stretch out of the lat that you literally just can't do that with two arms. So,
Yep. Yeah. Yeah, that was really interesting insight from him. And as I started to think about it, it made sense too, right? Like the setup, the like, more compound movements, the like you said, unilateral, those are all the ones that tended to he would burn out on the quickest. And that, I mean, that makes sense when you think about it. So last question on this kind of a training experiment. How are like, I guess two things, shirts fitting? Do they fit weird? Is like one side a little bit, can you notice a difference or is it the same? Because I'm assuming like, obviously when you get pumped up and after you lift, I'm sure I know you don't necessarily, I remember we've had this conversation. You're not like, the type of training you do doesn't necessarily lend itself well to like having massive pumps or anything like that. But like, have you noticed that anything with shirts and then like, just like your look, can you notice a difference or is it more like mental than anything?
no difference, man. Like, aside from the first 10 or 15 minutes after training where one side just feels super pumped, I literally notice no difference. And to be honest, like, when I look at myself in the mirror still, I still feel like my left arm looks smaller than my right. And like based on the measurements I took today, the right arm was a quarter inch bigger to begin with, and it seems like the right arm is still about a quarter inch bigger. So yeah, I have a very nihilistic view of this. Like I still think I probably that the measurements I took today are probably
Yeah.
user error or affected by glycogen or something. And I still think that my right arm is probably just a quarter inch bigger than my left, and nothing's really happened.
When you say glycogen too, one thing I think of is like potentially the one arm that you're using regularly could be a little bit smaller, right? Or or is that how it would be because you're using more glycogen in that muscle, so it could potentially be like those that would be depleted? Or am I totally overthinking that?
I feel like the training of that arm should shuttle glycogen
More.
into the muscle belly, so it should actually be bigger temporarily.
Okay.
Interestingly, though, I have been off. I took Friday, Saturday, Sunday off of the gym completely because I just finished my cycle before jumping into the neural phase. And then my first day of the neural phase had no arm training in it. So I have not trained my left arm at all in
Got you.
5 or 6 days now, which I think would decrease the likelihood of glycogen being an impact.
Gotcha. Cool. And then for you, you'll continue that and then just kind of work through the neuro phase. Anything else like coming up in terms of like I guess on the nutrition side, or you just maintenance, just do I know you when you build, you kind of just you're a little bit more intuitive about it. Are you cutting soon? Anything like that?
I've more and more become leaning on the side of the fence of just not trying to gain weight excessively, once you reach what your settling point is, just kind of hanging out there. And so my settling point really just happens to be about the mid 190s. And so over the holidays between Thanksgiving and New Year's, I ate everything in sight. And, we had family in town and they were constantly making like desserts and ordering out food and all that stuff. And so my weight got up to a top weight of 200 pounds, maybe like 10 days ago or something like that. And then I just went back to eating like an adult and having balanced meals. And without really even trying or being hungry, I'm back to 195 again. So, yeah, I just like at this point, man, I've become so nihilistic on whether I'm really making progress or not. And even if I am, like understanding that being in a large surplus is probably not conducive to gaining a good ratio of muscle to fat, that I pretty much just kind of get out of my deficit as quickly as possible after I diet and then land somewhere in the mid 190s and mostly just kind of hang out there.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I definitely think that there's, pros and cons to do it to pushing your body weight. And, I think at some points, like, especially as more advanced you get, I think it's like you definitely don't need to be in that large surplus to build muscle. So, and plus it's just, I don't know, like it's annoying too, honestly, to have to feel like you have to eat all the time as well too. And that can just be a pain. Cool. So I want to switch gears and kind of go towards more my training. So like we said at the beginning, you've been doing my programming now. I think we just finished our first meso. That was about 6 weeks. We're going into the second one now. So I guess really what I just more so just trying to get, what have been some like insights that you've noticed over the first mesocycle, if there are any, or anything that you feel like maybe was a big change from what I was doing. And I'm just kind of curious to hear your thoughts, and more so the audience can hear as well too. So
yeah. I don't know exactly what you were doing prior, so I'm not 100% sure what would be different, but I know from our discussion before starting that you were essentially training legs once a week, and you were having 4 upper body days, right? You had like was it a push and a pull and then a push and a pull?
yep.
Yeah. With one leg day in the middle. And the reason that was working for you was because your legs are your milkshake. They're your best body part. And you like that term?
Milkshake.
Yeah.
Yep.
Brings all the boys to the yard. Um,
Yep.
so uh so yeah, I think that you don't need a ton of volume or frequency really to get your legs to maintain or even continue to grow. And so you were obviously focusing on the upper body, which is great. But essentially what I did was come in and try to arrange things in a manner that um allows us to train muscle groups slightly more frequently, with slightly more intensity. And then I know that we have a split in which it's not a split. Like, and when people ask you your question on your Q&A and they're like,
Yep.
dude, what's your split? And you're like, well, let me,
Yep.
let me drop this for you. And it's like, lower chest with lower and mid lats and front delts or something like that.
Yep.
And so we have legs kind of splayed throughout the week as well, where instead of having one day where you just smash your legs, we have 2 or 3 sets of quads and hams on one day and 2 or 3 sets of quads and hams on another day, surrounded by more upper body stuff. So you kind of are training upper body in some way across all 5 of our training days. And then I know in the beginning of our training together, you were kind of concerned about making sure you got in all 5 of those sessions each week. And so you really wanted to train like Monday through Friday and take the weekends off type thing. And as we've gotten further into discussions and things like that, about volume specifically, I think that was maybe your main concern, was that by spreading out your training a little bit more, that maybe you're doing lower volume and therefore your results may be worse. But now it seems like you've kind of fallen in love with taking Wednesdays as a rest day midweek, which is near and dear to my heart too. Like I hate training more than 2 days in a row. I usually will go 2 days on, 1 day off, 2 days on, 1 day off, and just kind of do that on repeat when I'm in hypertrophy cycles. So I think that's a huge change. And then the obvious change is in the way that we're progressing things. going kind of through that model that I think I discussed on a podcast prior with you, but splitting the way that we progress things between lengthened movements and short movements. And while they both progress closer to failure week to week, the lengthened movements pretty much stop at around 1 RIR, depending on the movement. Like a face away curl will take to failure, but a pendulum squat we won't necessarily. And then the short movements, they progress to failure and then beyond failure using a number of the techniques that we've been talking about.
Yeah, I think with that, and to like also just being a little bit more like exercise dependent in terms of like the failure training and like how close to failure you get, right? Like you said there with more length and stuff, we're going to be a little bit further away from failure. But then like pendulum, you said same thing, you're going to be a little bit further away, but also taking into consideration that like for me, my legs are something that I'm not like overly concerned with trying to grow. So I felt like on average, the RAR for that was a little bit further away from failure. It may have been on a few exercises like leg curl and like leg extension. I think we got close to failure, but I know like pendulum, it was like it wasn't like ever super close to failure on that, at least from what I remember.
Yeah, I feel like I took you to like the final week before deload. I think was 2 RIR for one of the sets and 1 RIR for the other set.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then said, but with the leg extension, the leg curl, like so, a lot of why I progress things in these ways, and is basically the stimulus to fatigue ratio and the fatigue cost of getting close to failure. Like because your legs are such a good body part for you, it seems like an inappropriate amount of fatigue for you to take a pendulum or an RDL to failure when you could stop a rep or two shy. And from my understanding of the literature, it would not have any negative consequence.
Probably still growing muscle, but at the very least maintaining, which ultimately is what I want anyway. So, that's like you said, it doesn't make any sense to add more fatigue when you could just save those resources towards the upper body and things like that. And one other thing too, while it's on the top of my head that I mentioned this to you throughout that I noticed a big difference on was like, and it could just be the lower volumes that I'm again, but like I never felt super beat up at the end of a mesocycle, and that typically is how I would feel where it was like week 4, 5, 6. I never really went to 6 weeks. I would end up feeling like super beat up and like, just some like minor like niggles and like joints, just maybe like tendonitis type stuff like that. And I noticed that for me, that was never really the case, but I always felt like I was within my session and a little bit after, I felt like I was definitely getting more of like a stimulus, throughout. Like I could feel the muscles being like, I never got super sore. Chest was something that got a little sore, but I also felt like I was like the muscle groups were working and they just felt a little disrupted like after the training session, but not much after.
Yeah, no, totally. I've talked to you about this and I talked to Jordan on his podcast a number of times, but we always talk about this idea of the need to deload should be mostly or is usually almost always going to be psychological instead of physiological. And I just feel like if you've pushed your training to a point where physiologically, like literally you are failing to progress because your body is so beat up that you just like can't even manufacture the same performance you did the prior week, then I feel like we've already started falling off that ledge. But in your case, like, if what you tell me about, you're feeling the disruption and you're feeling the stimulus within the session and all of these good signs that we're getting, I don't worry that we're not doing enough. If, however, we were deloading and you were like, yeah, like, I feel like I could just keep going, like, not a big deal. Like I'm motivated and, the workouts aren't that hard. Then obviously at that point we have to do more. But given the feedback that you were giving me, and then when you said the thing where you were like, I don't exactly remember how you phrased it, but it was something along the lines of like, yeah, I don't feel completely smashed. Like I need a deload in my body, but like psychologically, I'm just kind of like ready for a break. And that was perfect, man. That was exactly what we want.
Yeah. It was more mental than anything, just that kind of like going in and like being like, fuck, I gotta add more, what, you just trying to overload or match or whatever, that I feel like that can be like mentally demanding, and like just you need to take a break from that. A couple other things too that I noticed, and like this is where, I've always been a big fan of like getting form videos from clients, but since I started working with you, I was like, man, I gotta just make sure I get these regularly, because I feel like I really focus on technique, and like, I have a lot of people that say, hey, like you're really into technique, and like, you're really focused on that. But it's like, even working with you, it was like, hey man, you still, there's certain things where like on the pendulum, it was like, you gotta, you know, there's some things you can change. You're stopping a little bit too much, I think, at the top. But even like my eccentrics, were a little quick too. So like for me, that's been another big like kind of change. And I'm sure that that's probably goes into the back to what I just said there about like not feeling like super beat up, right? Because I feel like that's a good way to potentially kind of put more stress on the joints and whatnot if you're not focused on those things.
Yeah, the speed of movement that I've been kind of harping on you on, did I even say harping on you on? But anyway, the things I've been discussing with you regarding your speed of movement, the research, the literature, it doesn't really show there to be an advantage to, say, doing a 3 or 4 second negative instead of a 2 second negative. Like they kind of are equal across the board. But the main reasons that I love a slightly slower negative, I think there's three. One is the joint integrity, like you mentioned. It just allows you to put more of that load during the eccentric onto the muscles that you're trying to work. Second, oh man, why do I lose my train of thought sometimes? So second is the slowing down into the transition. And so what I mean by that is like, I think the most important part of the descent is actually the few inches as you approach the very bottom. Because what most people will do, using the pendulum as an example, is as they approach the bottom, they make up that extra range of motion with hip flexion. So essentially the knees stop moving forward, but the hips still drop. And so at that point, the quads are no longer going to be the primary mover. But when you slow your way down into the last few inches of that eccentric, you can make sure that you're achieving that depth by continuing to push your knees forward. And then the third thing, and this kind of goes to the thing I said about resting at the top of the rep, is diagnostics of your results. I mean, it's like you see this all the time, especially with back squats, but it was happening with you on the pendulum too. But you have people all the time that will, 1 week they do 8 reps and it's kind of like up down up down up down, and then the next week they add 5 pounds and they get 9 reps, but the last 2 reps they stood there for like 3 or 4 seconds with the bar and they're like, coach, I added weight and I added a rep. And I'm like, great, because to me it looks like you didn't actually make progress. And you know what your quads are doing when you're standing there?
Nothing.
Jack shit. They're not even under load. So the way I try to look at it is like every freaking rep needs to look the exact same as the rep before it. And that's not just in the execution of that rep, but it's in the transitions between the bottom of the rep and the top of the rep as well.
Well, I think, 2 things I want to talk about on that. One, also just from a standpoint of just making sure that, and I think that's what you meant by this, but just to make sure that that's what you meant too, is like, for example, on the pull down, you're kind of saying like same thing there. I was like, you don't really know like where that, like you have to kind of standardize where that top end is and the bottom end, right? So like on the pull down, it was like you had partials at the end, but it was also like, it kind of becomes not as like clear in terms of like what is a partial, what isn't, right? So like making sure you like standardize that can be helpful. And then same thing you just did. I'm losing my train of thought, but God, what was the other one? There was one other thing I wanted to mention on that.
Speed of reps, transition between reps, descent to the bottom.
I freaking lost it. I lost my train of thought there on it. But I guess that's the other thing. And was that kind of what you meant there on that? The third one basically is.
Yeah, so you definitely have to standardize your range of motion, but kind of like what you alluded to with a movement that's very short overloaded and has a short strength curve, like a pull down, you get so weak at the short position, that you're going to be able to get 90% of the range of motion, then 80% of the range of motion, then 70% of the range of motion. And so to somebody looking from the outside, if without like a very trained eye, it might look very ambiguous. Like somebody might be like, oh, you got 10 reps. And I would look at it and be like, no, that was 8 plus 2. But like you can feel it too. And so this is one reason why I love filming, and why I like literally not just film it, but I pause my movement at different portions of the movement as I'm going through and reviewing the video and seeing where my elbow and my torso are. Because like, how many times have you seen people on any row movement, but especially chest supported row movements, where they're going and they're doing their reps great, and then as they get tired, they kind of throw the head forward.
Yeah.
And so you're throwing your head forward, you're rounding your torso out, which is getting your elbow to the same position that it was prior. So it may feel to you like you're still getting full range of motion, but when you review your video and you pause it at your contracted position, and then you can take a screenshot of, this was my first rep at full contraction, and this was my final rep at full contraction. And you can see your head position and your torso rounding over, and you can see the compensation that's occurring. And so I think, that just validates more the importance of videoing yourself, and also being in touch with what it feels like as compared to what it looks like, because oftentimes we confuse those two things in the middle of a set.
And so as you were saying that, it came back to me. And I think, again, it kind of, it was more so a question and kind of your thoughts on it. But do you feel like somebody can overthink that in terms of making each rep look the exact same? Or do you think that that is that important to do that?
It's a good question. I think in the end, your results in the amount of muscle mass that you gain is probably minimally or unaffected by that. But if you're an analytical person that likes data and likes to be confident that what you're doing is working, then I think that it's critical that those reps look the same. Otherwise, you don't know that you're actually getting stronger and progressing in the manner that you hope you are.
The reason I bring that up is because I feel like it's probably walking that fine line, because I could see where like somebody would like overthink it and then they never like actually freaking progress because they're like, oh, everything's got to be like to a T, right? And I think this was, I don't know if you listened to this, but on Revive Stronger, I think Scott Stevenson kind of talked about this recently too, about how you can like overthink it. So I was just curious to hear your thoughts, but I definitely think there's a lot to, standardizing your reps and really trying to, at least really trying to make each one look the exact same.
No, what Scott said was great. I actually really liked what he said, because what he essentially said was, you stay super strict until you can't do any more strict reps. And then you can use a little momentum, a little body English, or whatever sort of techniques you want, so that you can continue accruing reps. I think the important piece there, if you're going to utilize that, is the exact same as the way that you and I are utilizing partials. Yep. Is that we count the full reps that we did under perfect technique, and then we add a plus whatever. So you could do 10 rows that are perfect, and then you do 5 rows with momentum, or you do 5 partials. Whatever approach you want to take is fine. But you're going to call that 10 plus 5. You're not going to call that 15 reps.
Yeah, that makes sense. And basically that's just a way to almost, again, that's a form of progression and a way to force progression as well too, and whatnot. And I really like those partials. So one other thing on my training, this is more so, I want to get your thoughts on it, but it's also just kind of a funny comment too. So gym I train at, there's a couple trainers in there, and there's one cable machine and a dual cable, and then there's like a single pulley system. And one of the trainers there, it's like, and this is going to go into my question, but he was like, oh, hey, your machine's free, right? So it's like, basically, I feel like I'm always on the dual cable. And so like now he's starting to call that like my machine. And he just kind of like gives me trouble about like, oh, hey, maybe sometime you'll like use a barbell, blah, blah, blah. He's just messing with me and things like that. But, and it got me thinking, I was like, yeah, I mean, we do use a lot of cables, and I've really come to enjoy using cables. And so my question to you is, what is kind of the thought process behind having, a good amount of work using cables? Now, again, we don't only use cables, but I feel like, it's a pretty good, I would say it's a pretty good chunk of my routine.
Yeah, I think the answer to that is probably twofold. One, is that it just allows you to line things up a little bit better with the muscle that you're trying to target, which I think plays into point number 2, which is that for longevity and sustainability, I have found with myself and with many clients over the years that locking yourself into a single pronated grip movement, it just causes problems. It's either going to be wrists, elbows, or shoulders, or all three of them, or two of the three. But those niggles you talk about, the tendonitis, like that sort of stuff, it's literally ubiquitous across almost every single client I've worked with, is when we start taking away the ability to lock yourself into pronated position and we put you with a dumbbell or a D handle where you can move your wrist and alignment around to be more conducive to the line of pull that you're trying to work. Those niggles just go away. Like they're just gone. And that in itself is good enough of a reason as any to not touch a barbell again.
Yeah, I agree. I think that, now that I think about it, that's probably a big thing that is playing a role, is there is just a little bit more freedom in terms of, how you, like you said, position things. It can really, again, it's like, kind of like we talked about with like, your tightness in your upper back. It's like you do these things over and over again, like hypertrophy, even though we're technically doing like lower volume for hypertrophy, it's still high volume. Like you're still doing the same movement over and over again. It's like, you might not feel that the first time, but you do 6 weeks of hard training, you do high volume, and it's like all of a sudden you're going to start to notice that stuff really, pop up towards the end there.
Yeah. Have you did you used to do a bunch of either easy bar, barbell, or dumbbell tricep work in the
Oh
day?
yeah. Yep.
And how did that like end up feeling over the course of time on your elbows?
Elbow's not great, and even wrist, right? I mean, I
Yeah.
remember this was probably 2 years ago, and I still noticed this a little bit, but like left elbow still, like sometimes when I do certain tricep stuff, it's from doing like overhead skull crushers, and just I just remember one time I was like, fuck, dude, and so yeah, that's
Yeah.
definitely my experience with that, like that, and even like curls and everything like that. Used to do a lot of barbell easy curl type stuff with that. So
Yeah. I mean, at 40 years old, training 25 years, the last 2 or 3 years of training since I basically ditched the barbell and most free weight movements in general, aside from some dumbbell stuff, my body feels better than it has in 20 years since I was a teenager. So, yeah, you can't argue with that.
And with hypertrophy too, man, I just feel like it's so important to like find a way that you can just keep going at it for long periods of time, because that's where you're ultimately going to see the most progress, right? It's like, yeah, you could do high volume or something or like whatnot for like 6 weeks, but it's like, yeah, you'll see a little bit of muscle growth, but that's not how you're actually going to do that. Like you're going to see that when you accumulate time, with it as well, and like staying injury free, and these little things like that are so key.
Yeah, I love the thought experiment of taking two people that, for the thought experiment, are identical twins or whatever, have the same genetic makeup for the most part, and uh and one of them trains with like lower volumes and the other one trains with higher volumes, and where they are 15 or 20 years into their journey is probably going to be at the exact same place, but one of them is probably going to be a lot more intact than the other one. So maybe, and I'm not even convinced on this, but maybe doing higher volumes gets you to the goal a little bit faster, but there's definitely ramifications that come along with that.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, and yeah, if they stay injury free, like you said, maybe they'll get there quicker. But like you said, what's it going to be long term? I mean, look at somebody like I mean, obviously he had PEDs involved and everything like that, but like Ronnie Coleman, like he's obviously in bad shape now. It's like, is that where you want to be at that age, right? So what I want to kind of transition to now is, and I think that we can tie this in with like my training too, but like I had this question for you, like how would you go about, like we talked about volume just being like all over the place. It's like so many things are going to influence it. So like, what are some things that you look for to like be like, hey, this is a good amount of training volume for somebody or for yourself too?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing that I look for is that in session, that the muscle that you're targeting is receiving the stimulus that you want it to receive. Like you do 2 sets of hack squats and 2 sets of sissy squats, and then you hobble out of the gym because that was enough. And that ability to do that increases with training age. Aaron Straker, my podcast co-host, great example of this. For many years, he thought that he was a high volume guy. He was like, I need to do like I remember he sent me his leg day maybe 3 years ago, right before we started the podcast. And his leg day had 20 plus sets on it. It was like 4 sets of leg extensions, 4 sets of leg curls, 4 sets of hack squats, 4 sets of leg press, 4 sets of Bulgarian split squats, and 4 sets of calves, or something along those lines, 24 sets. And I remember just being like, man, I don't know how you do that. Right. And then over the course of the time that we've had this podcast now, we're in our 3rd year. And he just we had our reflections on 2022 episode, a couple episodes ago. And one of the things he talked about was that specifically the training volume piece. He's like, I don't know how I did that. But the reason is because he just didn't know how to recruit his muscles super effectively. He was just going from point A to point B, not necessarily making sure that he's pushing through the front third of his foot, pausing at the bottom, stretching the quad, like all of these different things that you kind of learn and become better at and hone these skills over time. He didn't do that. And now you look at his leg days, and in some ways he might even be doing lower volume than me. It's close, but he's man, he's like, how do you do more than 1 set of a split squat? Like, how was I doing 4 sets before? Like 1 set and I feel like I'm gonna die. And same thing with like a hack or a pendulum. Like, the feeling if you take a set of hack or pendulum to failure, like just psychologically you're not getting back in that machine again. So that kind of is like a roundabout way of saying that, determining your volume is very dependent on what you get out of each of your sets. And so internally, you have to feel that. And so when I talk to you and I hear from you that you're saying, I feel very disrupted in the session, I'm getting like a little bit of minor soreness here and there. And performance is going up. Like, to me, that sounds like a recipe for success. And so, the common sentiment around volume being the primary driver of hypertrophy is mostly based on population level research. And at a population level, I think we have to assume that most people are like Aaron Straker of 3 years ago, or even worse off than that.
Yeah.
I mean, Straker 3 years ago was 8% body fat at 192. Like, Straker of 3 years ago had a great, fantastic physique, and he still didn't know how to push himself and get the most out of his movements. So when we look at population level research and we say, this person had 2 to 3 years of training experience and can squat 1.5 times body weight, like, does that really apply to you? Maybe it doesn't, So I think that the amount of volume you need really is just dependent on what you can get out of the volume that you do.
So it sounds like the quality of volume is basically is going to be the most important thing is what you're saying there. Like, that quality that you do is really going to be the biggest driver of like how much you're going to have to do.
Yeah. Do you have a follow-up there, or should I continue with something?
Go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. So I told you this cool story on WhatsApp on our message the other day, but basically I had to go through this huge roundabout search to get my hands on some really cool data that I think your listeners will appreciate. So Scarpelli 2020, I think it's Scarpelli 2020. They did a really cool study. It's the first one of its kind where they actually had 16 subjects come in that were well-trained, and they had them state what their current leg training volume was. And then they put one of their legs on a nominal number of sets, 22 sets, which was based on a number they gathered from a number of research studies and found that was the average volume you used. So one of your legs is doing 22 sets. It was 11 sets of leg press and 11 sets of leg extensions. And then the other leg was doing 20% more volume than what you were doing prior. And the results are all over the place. One guy, and I don't have this data right in front of me because I'm saving it for this special episode I'm doing for my podcast. So I'm just going to go off memory real quick, but a couple standout examples. One guy was doing 10 sets prior, so they bumped him up to 12 sets. And then his other leg was obviously doing 22 sets. And this guy got like 15% muscle growth or something like that, 13 to 15% muscle growth in the leg where he was doing 12 sets. And he got like either none or like a very small amount, like a nominal amount of muscle growth in the leg that was doing 22 sets. You had another guy who was doing 42 sets before the study. And so
Real
you
quick,
had,
Brian, is this on a per week basis or?
yeah, per week.
Okay.
Yeah. This dude was doing 42 sets of quads per week. And so his leg that adds 20%, they bumped him up to 50 sets. And then the other leg was doing the nominal amount that everyone was doing, which is 22 sets. And he got the same results from 50 sets as he did from 22 sets. So this dude is doing like 2.5 times the amount of volume that he would need to do to get the exact same results. Granted, he didn't get worse results, but like, dude, you're doing 50 sets. You could be doing 22. So I think that volume is A, very individually dependent, and B, it's like we've been saying, dependent on the quality that you yourself can put into each set.
Yeah. So again, it's like, volume is, again, so I guess then what I want to ask off that is like, if, you say I was like doing the amount of volume that I was doing and like I wasn't getting like disrupted, would your first kind of thing be like, hey, let's really look at your technique, see where that's at? Or would it be, hey, let's add some volume?
No, my first would always be to look at your execution and exercise selection. I mean, assuming I'm doing your programming, then your exercise selection would be as I want it to be. So then the next thing to do would be to look at your execution. And in your case, your execution is good enough. Like I've told you, I think that you can do things with like your speed of your reps and your consistency of rep execution and stuff like that. But like, let's be real, your execution is like 99% of the way there. So knowing you, my first response with you would probably be to be like, hey, let's try adding a little bit of volume and see what happens. And then on the note of volume, the data-driven guys had a really interesting interpretation of this Scarpelli study that they kind of discussed at the end of one of their podcasts. And I thought it was really interesting because, what they pointed out was, how strange is it that people who are trained come into studies and in like an 8 to 10 week period, they can make 10%, 12%, 15% cross-sectional area increase. And they're trained. Like, could you imagine if you increased your thighs by 15% or your biceps by 15% or something like that? And so they were like, what is it about these studies? Like, are the programs that good that these people come in, or maybe the programs they were doing were that bad, but these people come into this study and suddenly they're getting these phenomenal results? Like, why is that, And so their theory, which makes a ton of sense, was that maybe using volume as a means of specialization is really where it's at. Because what these people are doing is they're coming into these studies and they're being told, hey, look, I know you're trained. I know you've been training your entire body. But what we're going to do right now is we're just going to have you focus on your legs. Like, you can keep training your upper body. You can keep training your upper body on your own outside of the research study. But when you come in here, we're training legs. And so now you have this dedicated focus. You have this time that it's like a date. Like twice a week, I come in and I just fucking hammer my legs. And so maybe it's the volume. Maybe it's the increased focus. And maybe we can just take that idea and say, hey, what if like we just we had a rotating schedule of specialization where at some point, one or two areas of your body was always being specialized on. And so you just know when you go into the gym for those 3 to 6 months that area that you're specializing on, that's the thing you need to focus on. And just by giving it that attention and that focus, you're going to work harder on it. You're going to have a better mind muscle connection. And maybe that is why people come into these studies and get such good results.
Yeah, that is a really interesting thought process. So basically what you're saying there is like, because they're, maybe when they're training on their own, it's like they're on their own, they're just kind of in their own routine. They're not really overly focused on it, but they go into this research and then it's like, because of that, it's like you're just going to focus on it a little bit more. Like same type of thing, I guess, would be like if you normally train by yourself, maybe you train with like a friend or something like that. And it's like that session's always like way better. And it's just because you're like more focused than what you normally would be or whatever.
Yeah, and that compounds over time, session to session.
Yeah, no, that is really interesting. On this topic too of like volume. So what I'm based on all the stuff you're kind of saying here, would you, if this was somebody that is a little bit newer to training, maybe they're like quality isn't necessarily like dialed in yet, like it would be for somebody for a while, would you maybe go a little bit higher volume with people that are less experienced knowing that, or would you still go a little bit lower with them and then just really work on execution technique and whatnot?
Yeah, I mean, you always, as you know, you have an intro questionnaire or a conversation with a new client, and so I always make sure that I review some videos of their form on like some basic movements, so I can get a sense of how they move, and then I obviously know how much volume they were doing prior. And so the answer to that is really, really individually dependent. But like on a very general level, like yes, my first inclination would probably be to raise volume for somebody that doesn't have like super great execution technique. Maybe has more of like an intermediate, early intermediate type training status, something along those lines. Like I really think that the training curve of volume over time is it really that in the beginning you don't need much. Like you could do a bunch because that could help your neurological learning and it could help you get better at performing movements, but you can also get really great results not doing much at all. But then it's really that like early intermediate into the intermediate and possibly advanced intermediate stage where your volume is probably the highest because you are the Aaron Straker of 3 years ago. Like you are that person that is thinking they need tons of volume, but they haven't actually really figured out how to like just absolutely massacre a specific area of their body so acutely. And then once it's almost like a way to define when you're advanced is you get to a point where you're like, that volume I was doing was insane. Like,
Yeah.
what was I doing with all that volume? Because I can get so much more out of less.
So it ends up being a thing where it like goes up and then it comes back down kind of on the back end there with it,
Yeah.
which it's interesting because even like a year or two ago, like people would look at my training and think it was low volume, but now I feel like it's funny how it's even more so lower volume now than it was before. So and again, I think it just comes down to the technique and execution of the lifts. Um, Cool. I think I don't know if I had anything else on that specifically. I thought maybe there was one other thing, but yeah, I think the big thing there is really dialing in your technique and execution can really go a long way. Otherwise, you probably end up doing a lot of extra work that you don't necessarily need to do, like that guy that was doing 40-20 extra sets per workout. I mean, that's essentially just junk volume there at that point
Yeah.
that he's
Yeah.
doing. So cool. Just have, I guess, a couple more just kind of questions that aren't on that, unless there was maybe anything you wanted to add to that conversation or to sum it up or anything like that.
No, I think we covered that pretty well.
Yeah. Cool. So just kind of two questions for you before we hop off here. My first one's going to be, so you have a home gym. Is there anything that you want to add? Is there like one piece of equipment that you're looking to add into your current
Man,
situation?
there's so many pieces of equipment that I want. I'm limited entirely by space and a wife that won't let me build out into the basement. Um, so I have a room that's 13 by 22. It's actually like so small that when people come in there, they actually can't believe that I have as much equipment as I do in there. It's been a labor of love moving big ass pieces of equipment around the gym and trying to like jigsaw puzzle the thing so that everything fits as it should and doesn't conflict with something else next to it type thing. But the I guess a funny story is my heaviest dumbbells were 100 pounds, and I have two movements specifically that I was using 100-pound dumbbells for, and they were getting too light. So they were my 45-degree hip extension and my single leg rear foot elevated RDL. And as you and I have discussed, I'm really not a fan of doing high reps of compound movements. So I was over 12 reps on my hip extension and I was over 8 reps on my RDL. And man, if you've done a single leg RDL for more than 8 reps, that is really, really hard to maintain focus and balance and rigidity and all that stuff. So on a whim, I went out and bought 110-pound dumbbells, super excited about it, $330. And then only to realize that I am going to be too strong for the 110s as well. So like, it just like, it was just a really flagrant, unnecessary purchase. And what I realized in retrospect is that I should have bought an open-ended trap bar instead of heavier dumbbells, because then I can do the rear foot elevated RDL with the open-ended trap bar. Don't have to worry about holding the dumbbells. So I'm probably going to do that. That's probably going to be my next purchase, is going to be an open-ended trap bar. I need one with rotating D handles for the reasons we discussed, joint integrity and all that. I'm pretty sure Prime Fitness is the only one that makes an open-ended trap bar with rotating D handles. So I'm probably going to end up having to buy the Prime Fitness one, even though it's, $800 or something stupid like that. And then the other thing that I like really, really want, but it's never going to happen unless I can ditch one of my other pieces of equipment, is I want some sort of chest pressing machine. I know there's like a leverage chest press that converges that you can lay down and do. That's not even expensive. It's like $350 or something like that, plate loaded. But I literally have nowhere to put it. And there's not a single piece of equipment that I could get rid of and be like okay with getting rid of. Like, if I were to choose one, I think it would have to be the chest supported T-bar row, but like I don't really want to get rid of that, because then I'm relegated to just cables for all of my back work. And already I don't have the ability to put my knees under pads when I do pull downs. I use that hack where I have like an airplane seat belt, and I basically like strap myself into the bench so that I don't get elevated out of the seat. So like that is one thing I really want. Like, I would love to have some sort of way to secure my knees for a pull down, and I'd love to have a chest pressing machine, but realistically it's probably the open-ended trap bar.
Yeah, just from a space standpoint. So I guess you have your cable stack. Was there any particular reason you chose that one over like a Prime? Do you like that one better, or is it just cost, or what?
It was actually size. So my ceiling is 88 inches high, and the Prime Prodigy rack or any of those Prime racks are 92 inches. So I would have had to go through the ceiling. Yeah. But this one was great, man. It came with 150-pound stacks like at retail, but they gave you the option of paying an extra, I don't know, $100 or $200 to add 50 pounds to each stack. So now I have 200 pounds on each stack, and yeah, it's been great, man. I love it. It's perfect width for the two different arms that move up and down. It's not as cool as the free motion ones where the arms both move up and down and in and out. But I wouldn't have had space for that anyways. So
yeah, that I guess you obviously have to see how there's obviously a height limit that you can have on certain stuff, so you have to look into that. Cool. So I guess we'll finish with this question. I feel like this is more like a personal question. I guess your top goal for 2023 for fitness, business, and just life in general.
Oh man. Well, for life in general, there's like a three-pronged approach to this. I am focusing a lot on trying to improve my VO2 max, as that has been it's the number one correlate to longevity and health span. So the comparison, do you listen to Peter Attia at all?
I don't.
Okay, cool. Well, he's kind of like he's an MD doctor that is into kind of some of this longevity stuff, but lifting weights and having muscle mass gives you like a 300% increase in or decrease in all cause mortality risk. And VO2 max in the top 25 percentile compared to the bottom 25 percentile, gives you a 500% decrease in all-cause mortality risk. So VO2 max is just slightly above lifting weights and having muscle mass, which I obviously have a lot of. So the thing that I need more of is VO2 max. And there's a few ways that I'm going about trying to improve my VO2 max. One is by focusing more on nasal breathing. So I've been mouth taping at night, and I've been doing little bouts of cardio without breathing through my mouth at all, just focusing on nasal breathing. I also have just been doing cardio, which is kind of something new for me. Usually I would just lift and walk, but in the last 6 to 8 months, I've been trying to make a concerted effort to actually do cardio. And then the third thing I'm doing is, as of January 1st, I'm only eating weed. I'm not smoking it anymore. So,
That will help.
so we'll see. Yeah, that's my thought, is that, I've done the cardio, I've done the mouth taping. Now I'm going to add this third prong and just stop smoking for 6 months or a year and see what happens. So those are my kind of life goals.
Yeah. I feel like that's fit. I feel like that's kind of fitness too, right? In a way.
Yeah, yes, it is. It is fitness for sure. I guess I associate, but given that this is like a podcast about like hypertrophy and training and stuff, maybe I was going more with like the
I
fitness
see.
question
I
in
got
that
you.
range. But no,
Okay.
you're totally right. That is sort of fitness based too. Um, but I think in life in general, it's just this process of betterment of self. And so I've also begun a mindfulness practice,
Cool.
not super intricately. I've just just dipping my toes in, and I presume that will kind of grow over time. Uh, but anyway, those are kind of like my life goals for business. Um, just continuing to kind of reach as many people as we can with programming, and you with my business partner, Lori Christine King, and then the kind of, I guess, COO of our company is a lady named Laura Savino, and she is awesome. She's been a huge gift for our company to come in and really help us organizing everything and getting some processes in order that for the first few years of our business we just didn't really have. And so utilizing kind of each of our different skill sets, I think that we can really put out a ton of good information across a number of different platforms and reach more people. So that's kind of the goal there. And then as far as fitness, or if we want to call it like hypertrophy and training, I want to continue doing these N of 1 experiments on myself. So I think after finishing this left arm training experiment in 3 months, I want to try what I was discussing earlier about constantly specializing, always having one area that's the primary focus, and then kind of putting the other 5 or 6 muscle groups on back burners. And then kind of rotating through that in a sequential manner, so that I'm not always like, hey, I'm just trying to bring my hamstrings up, and then I'm always just training hamstrings more. But it's like 3 months of hamstring and bicep focus, and then 3 months of quad and chest focus, and then something along those lines, where it's not long enough where I would worry about losing any muscle or strength in the areas that aren't prioritized. And it's constantly rotating through in a manner that I think each area will receive sufficient stimulus to continue growing, if I have any growth left to have.
So essentially, the special kind of like the specialization that you were just kind of talking about earlier, basically
Yeah.
is what you're talking about doing. Cool.
Yeah.
And then I guess real quick, do you think that trying to increase your VO2 max could potentially interfere with hypertrophy, or is that something that one, you're not worried about, or two, do you like? I guess, yeah. What are your thoughts on that?
It's possible, yeah, for sure. I think at this point, as you've probably gathered through this conversation and through knowing me for the last year or whatever, the gains that I have left to be made are quite minimal at this point. And I keep using the word nihilism, but like it really does sort of feel like maybe there's so much effort going into trying to gain hypertrophy when it's just an asymptote that has reached the bottom type
Yep.
thing. Um, and I also think it's possible that increasing my VO2 max could have
Yep.
positive benefits on my training via like just recovery and things like that. So I'm not convinced that it's going to be a detriment. I think it's possible that it could be. But I've also begun to really become intrigued by this idea of increasing health span as opposed to lifespan, but this idea of being 85 years old and my grandkid is running at me and I can still like pick him up and
Yeah,
like
that'd be
throw him
sick.
over my head or like
Yep.
something along those lines, you know? And so a lot of my focus, I think, in the next decade is going to be on that and not throwing hypertrophy to the side or anything, but maybe accepting a bit of a more of a maintenance protocol when it comes to that.
Well, like you said, there could potentially be maybe this additive effect where it's like, people are all like so quick to kind of bash like doing cardio where it's like, maybe a certain amount is going to get you a little bit more hypertrophy, at some point. But I feel like with you specifically, based on what you just said there, where like you said, one of your things that you're going to do is you're not going to be smoking, you're going to be just ingesting marijuana. It's like, that's something that you're not like doing extra in terms of training that could potentially hamper your recovery. It's like, so that wouldn't, to me, that wouldn't be something that would potentially like negatively impact hypertrophy. So
Yeah.
there with that.
Yeah.
Cool. One more thing too. Do you have time for one more or do we need
Sure.
it?
Yeah. Go
Okay.
for it.
Okay. So I had this potential client. Basically his job is like, he's home for 2 weeks and then he has 2 weeks where he's got to travel for work and he can't work out during those 2 weeks. How would you go about training? Is it just one of those things where, hey, hypertrophy just probably isn't going to be maximized in this particular person, or is there a way to kind of work around that?
He trains for 2 weeks and he doesn't train for 2 weeks.
Basically, he can't, he like works like 16, 17-hour days, like in those 2 weeks. So he says, right? It's like, I'm sure there's probably somewhere in there where he gets some time off that he's not thinking about, but I'm just curious, how would you potentially go about like programming for that person?
That's really interesting. Um, it kind of reminds me of that study from 3 or 4 years ago, and I'm blanking on the author's name off the top of my head, but the study was 24 weeks long, and it had one group that trained the entire 24 weeks all the way through without stopping. And then it had another group that did 6 weeks on, 3 weeks off, 6 weeks on, 3 weeks off, 6 weeks on. So they both ended up with 24 weeks. And at the end of the 24 weeks across the population levels, the results in hypertrophy were identical. There was no change, which is kind of counterintuitive to what you would think if someone's taking 3 weeks off every 6 weeks. But the rationale being that A, you probably don't lose that much muscle in that short amount of time. And then B, the muscle memory is so strong that you get it back so quickly that by the end of the 6 weeks, you've already caught back up to where you were prior. And so that's the first thing I think of when you say that, because granted, it's not 6-3, 6-3, 6-3, it's 2-2-2-2. But I think that the same sort of principle can apply. I mean, I do think that man, this is actually really complicated because I think initially the reaction is, well, we'll just give him tons of more volume during those 2 weeks. But
Yeah.
then you're like, well, then he's going to be so sore that there's not going to be any adaptation that takes place. So I guess my first inclination is you just train as you would normally in 2 weeks. You look at it as like a 2 week mesocycle. And then I think that during the 2 weeks that you're not training, I think you try to do some body weight stuff that helps you maintain. So maybe you buy a set of rings or angles grips and you can just hang them over like either a tree branch or a pull-up bar at a park or something like that. And if you can do push-ups or dips and pull-ups or rows, and then you can do, walking lunges, you can get a backpack and throw some rocks in it to add some weight. You can do sissy squats and Bulgarian split squats and stuff like that. I think that you can at least maintain or stay to keep the adaptation in such a place that when you go back to the 2 weeks of weight training, that you're not completely smashed from like lower efforts of work. So yeah, I think it's two different stimuli. Like maybe it's like, you're taking more of a lower rep strength side approach in the weeks that he has weights available. So maybe it's sets of like 5 to 8 or 5 to 10, depending on the movement. And then on the weeks where he's on the road or working hard or whatever, it's like, hey, let's do 100 pushing reps and 100 pulling reps over however many sets it takes. And we'll just try to do that twice a week with like I said, some lunges, some split squats and sissy squats. I mean, sissy squats are a great one. Pistol squats too, if he has the mobility to do a pistol squat. And if he doesn't have the mobility to do a pistol squat, then you can stand on a ledge, like a bench or something, a chair, and you can let your off leg descend down so that when you do that pistol squat, you're not limited by hip flexor mobility. And those are really hard, man. Like I can do 10 or 12 of those and I'll be sore for like 3 days. So I think a combo of like single leg squatting movements with some upper body pushing and pulling, and he at least should be able to, maintain
While he's gone.
before he can. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, because I could see where like if you did do that kind of two on, two off, it's like then you go back to train and it's like you're that first week you're just gonna get freaking sore as hell because you had 2 weeks off. So it's like you got to find a way to kind of lower that. So when you said just hammer the volume away, I was thinking maybe you could do something where that first week back it's a little bit lower volume, and that second week potentially bump it up a little bit, and then kind of I don't know.
Yeah, I agree, because then like you also could potentially have that like overreaching super compensation effect that occurs because you like hammer him maybe a little bit too hard in that second week, and then the first 4 to 5 days where he's on the road, maybe he doesn't even need to train at all because he's kind of compensating for that overreaching from the prior week, and then he has maybe 9 or 10 days where he does kind of what we discussed with the body weight movements.
Yeah, it's super interesting. He reached out, and well, he was a referral from somebody, and like I'm trying to find a time to set up a phone call with him, and I wanted to kind of hear your thoughts on it first before I chatted with him about it. But thought it'd be an interesting question and kind of thought process to hear how you did it. So cool, man. Well, we've been at this for an hour and a half, so obviously I think it's time we we shut it down for this time. We'll, like you said, we'll do it again. Appreciate your time, man. Ton of great information here. Is there anywhere we want to lead the audience to?
Yeah, just check me out on Instagram at Bryan Boorstein. You can check out my training companies, Paragon Training Methods and Evolved Training Systems. We do group programming for between $29 and $49 a month. And I have a podcast, like I referenced in here, where we talk about a lot of the same dorky, nuanced stuff that we talked about today. Eat, Train, Prosper is the podcast.
Cool. Awesome, man. We'll put that in the show notes, and we'll talk to you next time.